12 years ago, Aldo Moretti stopped speaking. Not because his throat was damaged, not because a stroke had taken his voice, but because on one blood-soaked night in a house on the edge of Lake Michigan, he decided that silence was the only thing left he could control. And for 12 years, no one had been able to take that silence away from him. Not the specialists flown in from Zurich, not the priest who sat with him every Sunday and prayed over a man who never once looked up. Not his own son, who ran an empire built on fear and blood and had never once managed to make his father say his name. Until a nurse nobody had heard of walked into that quiet, guarded room, knelt beside the old man's wheelchair, leaned in close to his ear, and whispered 4 syllables in a language she was never supposed to know. And the most dangerous man in Chicago felt the floor of his entire life tilt beneath him. Her name was Claire Whitfield, and she did not look like a woman who could unravel a criminal dynasty. She was 29, quiet in the way that made people forget she was in the room, with the kind of unremarkable competence that made hospital administrators trust her with the hardest cases and made everyone else overlook her completely. She had spent 6 years working with patients who had lost their words, stroke victims, trauma survivors, men and women whose minds had built walls their bodies couldn't tear down. She was good at her job in a way that never announced itself. She listened more than she spoke. She noticed things. And when the private agency called her about a live-in position for an elderly patient with selective mutism, a position that paid 4 times her usual rate and required her to sign a non-disclosure agreement 3 pages long before she was even given the address, she should have been suspicious. She was. She took the job anyway. The house sat behind 2 gates and a half-mile of black iron fencing, and the first thing Claire noticed, stepping out of the town car that had collected her from the airport, was the silence of it. Not peaceful silence, but the kind that comes from men standing very still, watching. Dante Moretti did not come out to greet her. He made her wait 40 minutes in a marble foyer before he appeared, and when he finally did, she understood immediately why grown men lowered their eyes around him. He was tall, in a way that filled a doorway without trying to, dressed in black that had clearly been cut for exactly his shoulders and nowhere else, and he had the kind of stillness that dangerous men learn instead of the fidgeting that nervous men can't help. He didn't offer his hand. He looked at her the way a man looks at a lock he doesn't yet have the key to, and he said, without any warmth at all, that she was the 11th nurse in 2 years, and that the first 10 had lasted an average of 9 days before they quit, were fired, or asked never to be contacted again. "I don't intimidate easily," Claire said, which was mostly true. "Good," Dante said, "because I wasn't trying to intimidate you. I was giving you a fact." Then he turned and walked deeper into the house, and she understood she was meant to follow, and that this was how every conversation with him would go for as long as she stayed. Aldo Moretti's room was on the 2nd floor, at the end of a corridor with no windows, guarded by a man who did not speak either, though for entirely different reasons. Inside, the old man sat in a chair by a window that looked out over a garden he never seemed to see. He had his son's bones, the same wide shoulders now collapsed inward, the same sharp jaw softened by age and by something heavier than age. His eyes moved. That was the thing the file hadn't quite captured. His eyes moved, tracked, understood. He was not gone. He was simply, deliberately, absent from his own mouth. 12 years of silence had made him a ghost, who still ate dinner at the same table as his son, still sat in the same garden chair every afternoon, still turned his head at sudden sounds, and said nothing, ever, to anyone, about any of it. Before we go any further into this story, if you find yourself drawn to tales of buried power, quiet obsession, and the kind of men who would burn down the world before they'd let anyone see them break, go ahead and hit that like button, And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories, because we are just getting started. And where this one goes, you will not see coming. And I want to know, if you were the one person who could reach a man who hadn't spoken in 12 years, would you dare say the word that might finally break him open? Tell me in the comments, because Claire is about to find out exactly what that costs. She was told the boundaries on her first night, delivered by Dante himself in the clipped, unhurried tone of a man reciting rules he expected to never need repeated. She was not to ask his father questions about the past. She was not to discuss the family, the business, or anything she overheard in this house with anyone, ever, under any circumstance. She was not to bring a phone with a camera past the second floor. She was not, under any circumstance, to attempt to make his father speak. Previous nurses, he told her, had tried, out of some misguided instinct to help, and it had ended badly enough that he'd had to let them go before they made things worse. Claire had asked quietly what worse meant in this house, and Dante had looked at her for a long moment before answering that some silences were load-bearing, and if you knocked one down without knowing what it was holding up, everything on top of it came down too. She didn't push that first week. She did her job the way she'd done it for 6 years. She learned Aldo's rhythms, the way he liked his coffee, the specific angle of afternoon light he leaned toward without ever asking for it to be adjusted, the 2 records he would let her play, both instrumental, both old. She noticed that he flinched, almost imperceptibly, at the sound of a particular kind of door, the heavy click of a specific lock mechanism used only on the wine cellar door in the east wing, and she noticed that his hands, when they trembled, always trembled in the same pattern. 3 short movements, and then stillness, like a hand remembering how to hold something it had once dropped. She wrote none of this down. She had learned, long before this job, that some notes were safer kept only in your own head. Dante watched her the way he watched everyone who entered his house, for the seam, the crack, the tell that would show him what she actually wanted. He had grown up learning that everyone wanted something, that kindness was a currency people spent expecting change back, and in 20 years of running an operation built on his father's ashes, he had never once been wrong about someone's angle. Claire Whitfield did not have an angle he could find, and that, more than anything, unsettled him. She didn't flatter him. She didn't flinch from him either. When he tested her, sudden, needling questions meant to catch her in a lie. Long silences meant to make her fill the air with something he could use against her. She simply answered what was asked and let the silences sit there, undisturbed, as if she had all the patience in the world, and none of his money could buy it away from her. He tried harder than he wanted to admit. He would appear in doorways without warning, watching her hands as she adjusted his father's blanket, watching her face for the flicker of performance that every other person in his life eventually showed him. The moment where kindness became a transaction, where care revealed itself as strategy. It never came. She was, infuriatingly, exactly what she appeared to be. And Dante Moretti, who had built an entire life around the certainty that nothing was ever exactly what it appeared to be, found that fact harder to sit with than any lie would have been. He began finding reasons to walk the second-floor corridor at hours he had no real business being there. He began noticing the particular quiet way she hummed under her breath when she thought no one was listening, an old tune he half recognized from somewhere in his own childhood. And he hated, with the specific irritation of a controlled man discovering an uncontrolled feeling, how much he had started to listen for it. It was on the 9th day, the day that had ended every previous nurse's tenure, that something in the house began very quietly to shift. Claire had been sitting with Aldo in the late afternoon, the record turning low, when she noticed, not for the first time, but for the first time she let herself really look at it, a photograph on the side table that had been turned face down for as long as she'd worked there. She didn't touch it. She had learned enough about this family in 9 days to know that touching things that had been deliberately hidden was how the previous nurses had found themselves unemployed, or worse. But she looked at the frame's edge, at the small brass plate along its bottom, and she saw, engraved in careful cursive, a single surname that made her hands go still in her lap. Castellano. It was not her surname. Not anymore. But it had been her grandfather's, before her mother changed it, before her mother packed a 6-year-old Claire into a car in the middle of the night and drove from Chicago to a town in Ohio where nobody had ever heard the name Castellano, and nobody ever would again if her mother had anything to say about it. Claire had grown up being told, in the careful, clipped way her mother delivered anything about the past, that her grandfather had done something unforgivable, that his name was a stain, that they did not speak of him, that they did not speak of any of it, and that, if anyone ever asked, their family had always been Whitfields, all the way back. She had taken this job under an assumed comfort that the world was large enough that coincidences like this simply didn't happen. Standing in that room, looking at a frame that had been deliberately turned away from view in the private quarters of the most powerful crime family in the city, she understood, with the particular cold clarity of a woman realizing she had walked into something with her eyes only half open, that this was not a coincidence. This was the reason the agency had called her specifically. This was the reason the pay was 4 times market rate. Someone in this house already knew who her grandfather was. The only question was whether Dante Moretti was that someone, or whether he had no idea at all, and she had just walked directly into the center of something he didn't know was standing in his own home. She said nothing. She finished her shift. She went to the guest wing they'd assigned her, and she lay awake long into the night, turning the name over in her mind, trying to remember every fragment her mother had ever let slip in an unguarded moment. A name, Salvatore, said once and never again. The word framed, muttered into a glass of wine on the anniversary of some date her mother never explained. The fact that her grandfather had died in prison, of causes the family had never elaborated on, when Claire was 11 years old, and her mother had not cried, had not gone to the funeral, had only sat very still at the kitchen table for an entire day, and then never mentioned him again. The next afternoon, she found the courage, or perhaps simply the recklessness, to ask Aldo Moretti a question she had been told never to ask. She did not ask about the massacre. She did not ask about his silence. She sat beside him, watched the way the light moved through the window, and said, very quietly, almost to herself, "Was there a man named Castellano in your life once?" Aldo Moretti did not speak, but his hand, resting on the arm of his wheelchair, closed slowly into a fist, and his eyes, for the first time in 9 days, moved from the garden to her face and stayed there, and something in them was not confusion. It was recognition. She did not tell Dante what had happened, not that day, not the day after. She told herself it was because she needed to understand what she was dealing with before she handed anyone a piece of a puzzle that could get her killed. And that was true, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was more complicated, and it had a great deal to do with the way Dante Moretti had started finding reasons to be in the same rooms she was in, the way his questions had shifted from suspicious to something closer to curious, the way he had, twice now, caught himself watching her with an attention that had nothing to do with whether she was a threat, and everything to do with something he clearly resented feeling at all. He came to her on the 12th night in the kitchen, long after the house had gone quiet, and he did not have a reason prepared, which for a man like Dante Moretti was itself a kind of confession. He poured 2 glasses of something dark and expensive, and set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it, and he said, in a voice with none of its usual cutting edge, that his father had eaten dinner that evening with his eyes on the door the entire time, the way he used to, years ago, before the silence, when he was still waiting for someone. Waiting for who? Claire asked. I don't know, Dante said, and the admission cost him something visible in his jaw. I was 17 when it happened. I know the story everyone tells. I don't know if it's true. She could have asked him right then to tell her the story everyone told. She could have laid her card on the table and asked him to lay his beside it and let the truth assemble itself between them like the pieces of something broken a long time ago. Instead, because she was still afraid, because the fear that had driven her mother out of this city in the middle of the night had apparently followed her back into it. Despite 23 years and a different last name, she asked him something smaller. She asked what the massacre had actually been. Dante told her, in the flat, controlled voice of a man who had recited this story to himself so many times, it had worn smooth like a stone. 12 years ago, his mother, Mariana Moretti, had been killed in the house's east wing during what the family had always called a rival hit. An attack by an enemy faction that had slipped past security, killed her, and nearly killed Aldo before being driven off. Aldo had survived. He had never spoken again. The men responsible were never caught, because, the story went, they had died in the retaliation that followed within the month, a retaliation so total that it had cemented Dante's father's reputation as a man not to be crossed, and had, ironically, been the last decisive act Aldo ever took before the silence swallowed him whole. Who told you this story? Claire asked. My uncle, Dante said. Salvatore. He ran the organization while my father recovered. He's the one who found the men responsible. He's the one who handled Borg. Claire's stomach turned to ice at the name, the same name her mother had said only once, into a glass of wine, 20 years ago. She did not say anything. She could not, yet, be certain. And a woman who says an accusation like this too soon, in a house like this, does not get a second chance to be careful. Over the following days, she began, with the particular quiet thoroughness of a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated and had learned to use that as a tool, to look for the seams in the story Salvatore Rocca had told a grieving 17-year-old boy 12 years ago. She noticed that Salvatore, uncle by marriage and consigliere in practice, had grown, in the years since the massacre, into a man with more real power in the organization than his position technically allowed, more men loyal to him personally than to Dante, more of the business quietly routed through channels he alone controlled. She noticed that whenever her path crossed his in the halls of that house, his eyes moved over her a half-second too long, assessing, the way a man assesses something he recognizes and hopes you don't recognize him back. And she noticed, on a night when she wasn't meant to be in that part of the house at all, chasing a sound she'd told herself was nothing, a locked door in the east wing, the same door whose lock mechanism made the exact sound that made Aldo Moretti's hands tremble in 3 short movements. And behind a loose panel she was not proud of prying open, a small metal box that had clearly not been opened in years, containing old photographs, a rosary, and a single-folded newspaper clipping from 12 years ago, reporting the arrest of a man named Enzo Castellano for the murder of Mariana Moretti, her grandfather's name, tied directly to the crime her mother had fled the memory of, a crime Claire now understood, with sick, sinking certainty her grandfather had not committed. Before this story goes further, into the truth that's about to break this family apart from the inside, remember, if the tension of a hidden past colliding with a dangerous present is exactly the kind of story that keeps you up too late, this is exactly why we make these. Stay with me, because what Claire finds in that box is only the beginning of what Salvatore Rocca has spent 12 years burying. She confronted no one that night. She sat in her room with the clipping in her hands and let herself, for the first time in 20 years, grieve a grandfather she had never really been allowed to know, A man who, she now believed with everything in her, had been framed for a murder to cover for the real killer, and had died in prison, carrying a guilt that was never his. She thought of her mother's silence at that kitchen table. She thought of a name changed to erase a stain that had never belonged to their family at all. And underneath the grief was something colder and sharper, the understanding that if her grandfather had been framed, someone had needed him framed. Someone who benefited from Aldo Moretti's silence continuing for exactly as long as it had. Someone who had every reason to make sure that silence never broke. She told Dante 3 days later, not because she had built up the courage all at once, but because she had run out of ways to avoid it, and because, somewhere in those 3 days, she had stopped being entirely certain she could trust her own judgment about whether telling him was safe, and she had decided that a truth this size could not stay locked in one person's chest forever, whatever the cost of saying it turned out to be. She told him everything, her real name, her grandfather, the box in the wall, the clipping, the years of silence her own family had kept, about a name she now believed had been stolen and slandered to protect the man who still sat at Dante's right hand every single day. She watched his face while she said it, watched the particular stillness that came over dangerous men when they were deciding, in real time, whether the person in front of them was lying. And she watched, when he finally believed her, something break loose behind his eyes that had nothing to do with anger at her, and everything to do with 12 years of grief he had built an entire identity on top of, now cracking at the foundation. "If this is true," Dante said very quietly, "Salvatore didn't avenge my mother. He killed her, and he let an innocent man die in a cell for it. And he's been sitting across from me at every dinner since, calling himself family." "I can't prove it," Claire said. "Not with a newspaper clipping and a locked box." "No," Dante said, "but my father can." It took another week of careful, dangerous work to find the moment. A week in which Salvatore Rocca, sensing something shifting in the house, began pulling in men Dante did not recognize, calling meetings Dante wasn't told about, and moving, with the patient calm of a man who had waited 12 years, and could not now afford to wait any longer, toward whatever final move he had always known he might one day need to make. Claire spent that week doing the only thing she knew how to do well, sitting with Aldo Moretti, talking softly about nothing, playing the 2 records he liked, watching the tremor in his hands, and slowly, carefully, in a language she had learned as a child from a grandmother who never stopped speaking it, even after her husband's name became something the family wasn't allowed to say, beginning to speak to him, quietly in Italian. She did not tell him what she knew. She did not accuse anyone. She simply spoke, day after day, of small things, in the language of his own childhood, until the walls he had built around his voice began, almost imperceptibly, to soften. Not because she forced them, but because for the first time in 12 years, someone in that room understood, without being told, exactly what he had been protecting himself from. The night it broke came without warning, the way these things always do. Salvatore Rocca, having decided that Dante's growing suspicion and the nurse's growing knowledge together made a fire he could no longer control by patience alone, moved to end both problems at once. He came to the house after midnight with 3 men he trusted completely, intending to make it look like an outside hit. The same story he had told 12 years ago, retold with fresh bodies, to bury the truth a second time. He had not counted on Dante already suspecting exactly this, already having quietly moved his own men into position, already having spent the last week rebuilding, piece by piece, the loyalty his father's stillness had let atrophy for over a decade. The confrontation happened in the East Wing, outside the locked cellar door whose sound had haunted an old man's hands for 12 years, and in the chaos of it, shouting, a gun raised, Dante standing between Salvatore and the room where his father sat. Claire did the only thing she could think to do. She went to Aldo. She knelt beside his wheelchair in a house suddenly full of danger, put her hand over his trembling one, and leaned close to his ear, and said the single word her grandmother had once told her was the last thing a person says before they choose. Finally, to trust someone completely. Fidati, she whispered. Trust. It was, she would learn later, the exact words Salvatore Rocca had said to Aldo Moretti 12 years ago, in this same wing of this same house, in the seconds before he turned and put a knife through Mariana Moretti's chest and let an innocent man take the blame for it. Trust me, he had said. And then he had taken everything from him, his wife, his voice, his 12 years, all of it, wearing the mask of loyalty the whole time. Aldo Moretti's eyes moved past Claire, past his son, and found Salvatore Rocca standing in the doorway with a gun in his hand, and for the first time in 12 years, in a voice cracked and raw from over a decade of disuse, Aldo Moretti spoke. You, he said. You said that word to me, before you killed her. The room went utterly still. Salvatore's face, for one unguarded second, showed the whole truth plainly, before he recovered into denial, into rage, into a last desperate attempt to finish what he'd started. But it was too late, because Dante's men, who had been loyal to a silent old man and a distant heir for 12 confusing years, had just heard, in their own boss's voice, the name of the man who had truly murdered Mariana Moretti, and loyalty, in a house like that, does not survive a moment like this. Salvatore Rocca did not leave that house again. What followed in the weeks after was not clean, and it was not simple, because the truth rarely resolves itself into something tidy, however satisfying the ending feels. There were men to be dealt with, loyalties to be rebuilt, a name, Castellano, that had to be publicly, formally cleared through channels that cost Dante more of his own power and reputation than he had ever spent on anything in his life, because he decided, once he understood what had truly happened, that an innocent man's name mattered more than the convenience of leaving the old story intact. Claire's grandfather's record was expunged. Her mother, when Claire finally called her, sat in stunned silence on the other end of the line for nearly a full minute before she began, quietly, to cry. Not for the shame she'd carried for 20 years, but for the first time. For grief she'd never been allowed to feel honestly. Aldo Moretti did not become a man transformed overnight. 12 years of silence does not undo itself in an evening, however dramatic the night that broke it. But he spoke, now, in small pieces, to his son, to the woman who had given him back his voice, to the garden he finally, truly looked at again, instead of merely facing. And Dante Moretti, a man who had spent 20 years believing that power meant never needing anyone, found himself, for the first time in his adult life, standing in a doorway, watching a woman who had walked into his house with nothing but a nurse's badge and a name she'd been taught to hide, and understanding that the only thing in this world he had never been able to control was exactly the thing he now could not imagine living without. He did not say it the way other men might have. He was not built for soft words, and she had never asked him to be. But on the night everything in that house finally went quiet in the good way, the way a house goes quiet when the thing haunting it has finally been let go, he found her on the same garden path his father had stared at for 12 years, and he said, simply, that he did not know how to be a man who needed someone, but that he intended, however badly, to learn. Claire Whitfield, Claire Castellano, she would let herself think now, in private, in the quiet, did not need him to be perfect. She had spent her whole life being the calm in other people's storms, and she understood, better than most, that some of the strongest men in the world are the ones who finally admit they've been holding something too heavy for too long. She took his hand. She did not say anything grand. She simply stood beside him in the dark, the way she had stood beside his father through 12 years of silence, and let the quiet between them be, for once, the kind that didn't need breaking. If you were captivated by Claire's hidden strength and Dante's dark, guarded obsession, don't forget to hit that like button. We love bringing you these intense stories filled with betrayal, power, and unexpected twists. What would you have done in Claire's shoes, standing in that house with a truth that could get you killed? Drop a comment below and let us know. Make sure to subscribe to the Mafia Boss Stories and turn on notifications so you never miss a story.